a war-torn nation, a $62 billion lifeline, and a regional superpower trying desperately to stop it. Afghanistan is about to gain something it's never had before, and India is watching in alarm. This is the story of how one railway could redraw the power map of South Asia. The announcement came quietly, but its implications echoed across continents. China and Pakistan have officially confirmed that the massive China-Pakistan economic corridor, worth a staggering $62 billion, will now stretch its infrastructure network into Afghanistan and potentially across Central Asia. At the heart of this expansion lies a railway connection that will link Pakistan's strategic Gwadar port directly to Afghan territory. For a nation that has been landlocked and isolated by 4 decades of continuous conflict, this represents something extraordinary, a genuine pathway to the global economy. Afghanistan, long cut off from international trade routes and crippled by instability, could finally connect to the outside world through this corridor. But not everyone is celebrating this development. India has emerged as the most vocal opponent of this expansion, raising concerns about what it calls geopolitical threats to regional stability. The reasoning is straightforward. A united economic front between China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan creates a formidable strategic alliance positioned directly along India's northern borders. The stakes are enormous. If this corridor succeeds, it could fundamentally alter the balance of power that India has worked decades to establish. Today, we're examining what this expansion could mean for Afghanistan's future and what strategic challenges it creates for India. Understanding the corridor. To grasp why this expansion matters, we need to understand what the China-Pakistan economic corridor has already accomplished. The corridor represents one of the flagship initiatives under China's Belt and Road Initiative. First proposed in 2013 and officially launched in 2015, Chinese and Pakistani officials signed 51 cooperation agreements in a single sitting, with total investments projected at $62 billion, a figure that exceeded Pakistan's entire foreign currency reserves at the time. The implementation was divided into phases. Between 2015 and 2020, the focus was foundational. Pakistan desperately needed better infrastructure. The country suffered from chronic electricity shortages with daily blackouts in major cities. China invested heavily in power generation facilities and constructed thousands of kilometers of modern highways. The second phase, which began in 2020, shifted toward deeper economic integration. Now the emphasis is on industrial cooperation, building special economic zones, establishing manufacturing facilities, and creating jobs. But for Beijing, this project has always been about much more than helping a friendly neighbor develop. The corridor solves a critical strategic vulnerability for China itself: China's energy dilemma. China faces a geographical problem that has worried its strategic planners for decades. The country's energy lifeline is dangerously exposed. Consider the journey of a typical oil shipment to China. Tankers loaded with crude oil must travel thousands of nautical miles across the Indian Ocean, then squeeze through the Strait of Malacca, a narrow waterway barely 2 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. This single strait handles more than a quarter of all global oil shipments. It's also incredibly vulnerable. The United States maintains significant military presence throughout the region. For China, which imports approximately 80% of its oil through this route, the implications are sobering. A blockade could cripple Chinese industry within weeks. The China-Pakistan economic corridor offers an alternative, a land-based route that bypasses these maritime vulnerabilities entirely. Energy supplies and commercial goods can travel by rail from China's western Xinjiang region through Pakistani territory and reach the Arabian Sea at Gwadar port. The distance is thousands of kilometers shorter, and crucially, it isn't dependent on narrow straits that could be blocked. This is why China continues to push for the corridor's expansion. It's not just about trade efficiency, it's about national security and energy independence. Why Afghanistan? Earlier this year in May, representatives from China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan gathered in Beijing. The Taliban government sat down with Chinese and Pakistani officials to discuss economic integration, and all three parties agreed to extend the corridor into Afghan territory. This really raises an obvious question. Afghanistan is landlocked, economically devastated, and has been mired in conflict for over 40 years. Why would China extend this multi-billion-dollar corridor into such uncertain territory? The answer becomes clear when you look at a map. Afghanistan occupies a uniquely strategic position at the crossroads of Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East. Any overland route connecting China to the Arabian Sea must either pass through Afghanistan or make a much longer detour around it. Afghanistan sits between Iran and Pakistan, making it a natural gateway for China's westward infrastructure networks. There's also the Wakhan Corridor, a narrow strip of Afghan territory that actually shares a small border with China. Though extremely mountainous, it represents a direct physical link between Chinese and Afghan territory. For China, Afghanistan's stability is also a matter of domestic security, particularly concerning Xinjiang province. Afghanistan has historically been a center of extremist activity, and instability there poses security risks to China's western regions. Rather than watching Afghanistan descend further into chaos, China prefers to bring it into a broader regional development framework through economic cooperation. The hope is that by helping Afghanistan build infrastructure and establish trade connections, the country will gradually stabilize. What Afghanistan stands to gain. When the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor first launched, Western observers were skeptical. Nearly a decade later, the results are visible in Pakistan new power plants that reduced electricity shortages, a modernized highway network, and operating industrial parks. These are concrete outcomes, and a similar story could unfold in Afghanistan. Consider Afghanistan's fundamental challenge. It has no access to the sea. Every item the country imports or exports must travel overland through neighboring countries. Currently, Afghanistan relies on three main routes. The first goes through Pakistan to Karachi's port, but this route is frequently disrupted by political tensions. The second runs through Iran to Chabahar port, but international sanctions have limited its development. The third involves routing goods through Central Asian countries, which is stable but logistically complex. Goods must cross multiple borders with varying regulations. The result is that Afghanistan's logistics costs are 2 to 4 times higher than neighboring countries. Access to the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor would fundamentally change this equation. If Afghan goods could reach Gwadar port through direct railway connection, the country would gain reliable access to international shipping lanes. Take agriculture, which accounts for roughly 30% of Afghanistan's GDP. Afghanistan produces high-quality pomegranates, grapes, almonds, and saffron. But without proper cold chain infrastructure or processing facilities, much of this produce never reaches international buyers in good condition. With better connectivity and investment, Afghan agricultural exports could expand dramatically. Afghanistan is also extraordinarily rich in minerals, copper, iron ore, rare earth elements, lithium. Some estimates value Afghanistan's mineral wealth at over $1 trillion. But without reliable transportation to ports, these minerals stay underground. The corridor could change that calculation and attract investment Afghanistan desperately needs. India's strategic nightmare. While Afghanistan and Pakistan see opportunity, India sees a growing strategic threat. India is the dominant power in South Asia. In 2024, India's GDP reached approximately $4 trillion, while the combined GDP of all other South Asian countries doesn't even equal half of India's total. India also maintains overwhelming military superiority in the region. But the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor represents a different kind of challenge. It's creating an integrated economic bloc along India's borders. China, Pakistan, and now potentially Afghanistan are linking their infrastructure and building mutual dependencies. This doesn't just compete with Indian influence. It offers an alternative framework for regional development that doesn't depend on New Delhi at all. If the corridor succeeds in spurring development in Pakistan and Afghanistan, it demonstrates that countries in the region can achieve economic progress without Indian involvement. It undermines India's position as the regional power broker. India's failed response? Well, it's not for lack of trying. India hasn't sat idle. At the 2023 G20 summit, India promoted the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor as an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Multiple countries signed a memorandum, and Indian officials promoted it as a real game-changer. But then, reality intervened. Within just a few weeks, the Israel-Palestine conflict escalated dramatically, and instability in the Red Sea intensified. Suddenly, the proposed route looked far less viable. But honestly, the problems went even deeper. The initiative lacked concrete details from the very beginning. Where would the funding actually come from? India just doesn't have China's financial capacity for infrastructure investment. And how would it even be implemented? There was no clear governance structure or mechanism for coordination. The entire proposal, in the end, appeared to be more political theater than serious economic planning. China's approach is fundamentally different. Fewer parties involved, China provides most of the financing, and Beijing maintains control over implementation. These factors make it far more likely to actually be built. There's another critical factor in India's opposition. The route passes through Kashmir. Kashmir has been the central territorial dispute between India and Pakistan since 1947. A ceasefire line established in 1949 stretches roughly 770 kilometers, with India controlling the southern portions and Pakistan controlling the northern areas. Both countries claim the entirety of Kashmir. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, after leaving China, enters the portion of Kashmir under Pakistani control. From India's perspective, this constitutes a violation of sovereignty over disputed land. Every time Pakistan builds major infrastructure in Pakistani-controlled Kashmir, it strengthens Pakistan's de facto control. Roads, power plants, and railways aren't just economic assets. They're physical manifestations of sovereignty. If the corridor brings prosperity to this region, it makes the status quo more sustainable and, honestly, harder to challenge. Even more troubling for India, Chinese involvement gives Pakistan a powerful ally with vested interests in maintaining current territorial arrangements. China has invested billions in infrastructure running through this territory, so Beijing has strong incentives to support Pakistan's position. On issues of territorial sovereignty, no Indian government can afford to appear weak. The Kashmir dispute evokes deep nationalist sentiment, and any government seen as compromising faces severe domestic political consequences. The Pakistan-Afghanistan paradox. Here's something puzzling. Earlier this year, Pakistan and Afghanistan had serious border clashes. So, why would Pakistan support Afghanistan's inclusion in its most important economic project? The answer lies in Pakistan's strategic calculus. Afghanistan represents both a security challenge and opportunity. The two countries share a long border that's honestly quite difficult to secure, and militant groups have historically used Afghan territory to launch attacks against Pakistani targets. If Afghanistan achieves stability through economic development, it provides security benefits for Pakistan. A stable Afghanistan with functioning infrastructure has less reason to tolerate militant groups and positive incentives to maintain order. Furthermore, China can play a mediating role. With both countries participating in Chinese-led initiatives, Beijing gains leverage to encourage peaceful dispute management. Both Pakistan and Afghanistan recognize that the potential economic benefits of cooperation far exceed whatever advantages might come from continued hostility. The broader transformation. What we're witnessing is the potential reorganization of South Asian geopolitics around new economic realities. For decades, the power structure was simple. India dominated, Pakistan resisted, and smaller countries tried to balance between them or align with India's superior power. Afghanistan was isolated, its chronic instability keeping it on the margins. The corridor is changing this by introducing a new variable: Chinese economic power. China is offering massive infrastructure investment with relatively few political conditions. India simply doesn't have the financial resources China can deploy. This creates options for smaller South Asian countries that didn't exist before. They're no longer forced to choose between aligning with India or facing isolation. They can pursue Chinese investment as an alternative development path. For India, this represents a fundamental challenge that military superiority alone cannot address. You can't bomb a railway into irrelevance. India's traditional sources of regional influence remain significant, but they're being supplemented by China's ability to finance and build the infrastructure developing countries desperately need. Looking forward, whether Afghanistan's participation will ultimately succeed remains uncertain. The challenges are enormous: severe security problems, weak institutions, endemic corruption, and widespread poverty. There are also, serious questions about whether China's investments truly benefit recipient countries long term. Some argue that Belt and Road projects burden countries with unsustainable debt and primarily benefit Chinese companies rather than local populations. But Afghanistan is moving forward because its alternatives are limited. Continued isolation has brought nothing but poverty and conflict. Integration into regional economic networks represents one of the few realistic paths toward development. For Pakistan, the corridor has become central to national development planning. For China, it serves multiple objectives: providing alternatives to vulnerable sea routes and extending Chinese influence. And for India, the expansion represents a challenge that won't be easily addressed through military power or diplomatic protests alone. What we're witnessing is a pivotal moment in South Asian geopolitics. A war-torn nation is being offered a connection to global markets. A massive infrastructure project is expanding its reach. And a regional power is facing a new kind of challenge, one that can't be solved through military superiority alone. The railway lines being planned represent more than just transportation infrastructure. They represent a bet on a different future, one where economic integration might create incentives for stability, where landlocked nations can access global trade, and where development might follow paths that don't run through New Delhi. Whether that bet pays off will shape South Asian geopolitics for decades to come. The old order is changing. Railways are being built, agreements are being signed, and the map of power is being redrawn. For millions of Afghans who have known nothing but war, this corridor might represent something they've rarely experienced: hope.